This is Jean Peck on Captiva, interviewing Pintard and Parker Mills. We'd like you, Pin and Parker, to tell us when and why you first came to our lovely island.
Parker, you take this.
All right. Well, when I got back from Japan in the spring of '46, Pin and I had never had a proper holiday together, and she was a stylist at Macy's in New York, and I persuaded her to take a leave of absence, and we cast about in our mind where we would go. We had only had a weekend honeymoon up to that time, and so I'd fallen in love with San Francisco when I went there, back through there 3 times during the war. But that was so far away, much further away it is now somehow, and we didn't know anybody I could get out there. So Pin remembered that her sister, the youngest sister, had spent a honeymoon in some island in the Gulf of Mexico. So we got on the phone to Lynette and talked to her, and found it was Captiva. And we heard about the Gulfview Inn and Twin Waters Inn and South Seas Plantation. And
Parker, let me interrupt a minute and say that my young sister had married Shelley Miner, and the Miners at that time were the owners of the present Matheson house, the big Spanish house.
Oh yes, and well, we'll get to that later on when we lived in their backyard in a houseboat.
Yes.
Where was I?
You would decide to come to Captiva
Oh yes,
for
well,
your vacation.
well we did. We ended up at Gulfview Inn, and
Now, for those people who don't know, the Gulfview Inn was where?
Where the what is now the
Lucky Duck.
Mucky Duck, and we rented a boat, an inboard motorboat from Andy Rossi. He had quite a number of adventures of that, going around, running on sandbars and all that, and getting out and pushing it off. And but we just loved it. And I hadn't been here 2 weeks before I said to Pin, we've got to buy a lot and hope someday we'll have enough money to build a house here. And she still poo-pooed the idea. But before we left, we went over to Kate Jeffcoat, who was then the leading realtor in Fort Myers, and bought 100 feet south of our present home. And
On the Gulf.
on the Gulf. And
South on the Gulf. Captiva at that time can best be described by a story regaled to us by that great and gentle musician, Albert Spaulding. One afternoon, as the tide was coming in, Albert had gone down to the little one-way wooden bridge that connected Captiva and Sanibel to fish. He was alone on the bridge and hadn't been there long when he was jolted out of his reveries by a jalopy, which came to a noisy stop by his side. 6 or 7 youthful heads popped out of the roll-down windows, and the one behind the wheel asked, "Hey, Bud, what's on the other side of this rickety old bridge?" "Captiva Island," answered Albert, and prepared to concentrate on his fishing. "Got a gas station over there?" "No, I'm afraid not." "A movie theater?" "No." "A dance hall?" Albert shook his head. "How about a soda fountain?" Again the answer was negative. At each no, the faces of the occupants of the jalopy became more and more incredulous. Finally one asked, "Well, what is over there?" Albert then extolled the beauties of the island. On one side we have a broad, untrampled beach reaching into the Gulf of Mexico. On the other side, San Carlos Bay with the blue sky above, and the fresh green palm trees, sea grapes, mangroves, pine trees, poinciana, flowers galore, hibiscus, oleander, Spanish bayonet, night blooming cereus, prickly pears, and birds, cardinals, woodpeckers, sandpipers, eagles, herons. Then there are lizards, raccoons, all manner of flora and fauna that God has wrought and placed on this island paradise. A small group of delightful people who, "Wait a minute," interrupted the driver of the jalopy, stepping on the starter and drowning out Albert's soliloquy. "How do you get out of this goddamn dump?" "Cross the bridge, turn around, and go back the way you came," instructed Albert, as he cast into the path and probably caught a good-sized snook. After telling this story, he chuckled and remarked, "With that attitude, I guess we'll never have to worry about there ever being too many people on this island." Well, that was the unspoiled Captiva that we enjoyed before the construction of the causeway, which has brought the crowds of people, heavy traffic, noisy trucks and bulldozers, screeching motorcycles, not to overlook the condominiums, which will eventually sink our island into a mire that Albert Spaulding thought impossible.
Well, the Ark is now the Stranahan House, a initial part of it. It was out in the bay, anchored off the dock, and it had a plumbing, and we weren't too self-conscious about where the sewage went in those days. I don't think it went right into the water, but maybe it did.
Excuse me a second, Parker. This is the first place you visited and stayed after you had your nice vacation at that Gulfview Inn.
This was the same time.
Enjoyed. Same time, okay.
The reason we went to the Ark was because Gulfview, their season started in the 15th, at the 15th of January. We didn't come down before Christmas.
They had
at
commitments.
that time, which was not part of the season.
Yeah.
The season didn't begin until after Christmas. Okay. So we had fallen in love with Captiva, and we tearfully went to Alice Miner and said, "Al, what can we do? You found us Gulfview. Can you find us another place to stay?" And that was when Alice offered us the Ark, which was their houseboat, very well equipped. Alice Miner was a very efficient, wonderful person, and she and Pat, her husband, had built the Ark and equipped it with, there were 2 bunks, there was a little refrigerator, there was a sink, there was a head, there were storage spaces. In fact, there was nothing that you couldn't, there was everything that you would really want.
And this was set in the water down on the bay behind the
water, little dock down.
And then the Miner home
And the Miner home
is what now is the Matheson home.
Yes.
Alice and Carl Miner used to use that house, the houseboat. They'd have it towed up to some bar in the bay somewhere and stay for several days to do their shelling. And Alice was quite a sheller. She had a wonderful collection of shells. I don't know where they all got to now, whether Mrs. Bixby got some in there. No, that's beside the point. About 100 feet south of our present property, so as not to crowd Duncan Dean, who was building this house at the time, and he was from Asheville, North Carolina, a very nice little gentleman, and he eventually got to the point where he couldn't come down alone, so he cut out the carport and made a small bedroom out of it, so his daughter could stay with him winters. And then when we took it over, the room we're sitting now, the dining room, was the porch. And out here was a cement cistern. Pin used to collect her driftwood on it. And she made mobiles like mad for years. She hadn't made any for some years. I don't know, she's outgrown them or what.
No, the people have come and taken all the good driftwood.
Yeah, there's not as much driftwood as there used to be. That's quite true.
We felt that we really should have our property adjacent to each other. This little house on 50 feet. Then there was the 100 feet that belonged to someone, we didn't know just who, and then there was the 100 feet that we owned. And we wanted to swap those 100 feet, 100
foot lots.
And we found that Mr. Heithaker, from whom we bought the original 100 feet, was the owner of the ones between us. We sent letters and we tried to contact him through lawyers, but he was a very elusive person. However, in 1952, just after my mother had died, I was in Pennsylvania settling her estate, and one night the telephone rang and Parker was on the other end of the wire and said, "Pin, where's the deed to our property, our 100 lots. I can't find it in the safe deposit box down here. And I said, well, no, you can't because it's in the safe deposit box in New York. He says, I've got to have it. Why? Well, because he said, we're going to swap those lots. Well, I went back to New York, got into the safe deposit box, sent the deeds down, went back to Mother's house, and finished up our business there with my two sisters, and then went back to New York again and continued my job. This was in February. At Easter, I took some time off and came down to Captiva, having really forgotten all about this swap business. Parker met me on Easter Sunday morning at the airport, and he said, Finn, we're not going directly back to Captiva. He said, I've got to go in to the lawyer, and we have to sign the papers for the swap of our lots. And I said, oh, all right, I'd forgotten about that. But we went on into Fort Myers on a bright Easter Sunday morning, and went to the lawyer's office, which was on the second floor. And those times, no one ever locked up anything. This was Sunday morning. The place was wide open. We walked into the lawyer's office, no key in the door, papers all around. And I said, where is the lawyer? And
Oh, he was, I don't know, he was out with his wife. He'd just come from church or something. And most informal do. The gentleman who was buying the lot, was swapping the lots from, did not appear. He didn't choose to come in from Fort Myers Beach. And the lawyer assured us that it'd be all right. He'd take care of it. He'd see the gentleman tomorrow, and we'd get the signed document. We paid our $100 to make the swap, what it was.
And don't forget, we had to have our signatures witnessed. And
Oh,
the
yes.
the lawyer said, oh, that's all right. He said, my wife's down in the car. We're on our way to Easter service. She's down in the car. She'll witness your signatures. So down the steps we went, out to the car, and in front of the car was one of these garbage trash cans with a swing top to it. And Mr. whatever the lawyer's name was, held one side of the swing top. We put the deed on the other side, and Parker signed it, I signed it, and Mrs. Lawyer signed it. And away they went. And I said, Parker, after they had gone, I said, Parker, where's our receipt? The man's gone.
Everything done in trip.
The man's gone with our money, and he says we'll get this back. I said, look, at Macy's, we sign everything in triplicate, quadruplicate. I said, we have nothing. And Parker said, oh, don't worry. He said, you're in Florida, and that's the way they do things down here. So sure enough, we went back to Captiva. I talked to a few of my good friends out there, and they said, oh, don't worry. This is Florida, of course. You'll get that. And the lawyer said we would get it within a week. The first day went by, went to the post office, no deed. No deed the second day, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, the seventh day. There it was in the mailbox. So that's the way we do things in Florida then.
Now, Parker, I understand the Island Store was a home of yours, or a bailiwick. Well, tell us all about that.
Well, yes, it was. I lived in various places while I ran it, the first ran it, because we had rented this house, and I sort of lived in a room which is now owned by Paul Staley, I do believe it's still owned by him, where I was adjacent to a beauty shop. And the toilet facilities were through the beauty shop. And I had to ensure that time my absolutions, if that's the word, when there was no customer in this beauty parlor chair.
Now, this is behind the Island Store.
Yeah, it's
There, it was.
Paul Staley.
He lives there now, and there was a beauty shop there too.
Yeah. What was the name?
Don't remember. Well, that's okay.
Jay Darling owned that
all that
property too.
He owned all that.
And then the little house that has recently been owned by the Hans.
Mm-hmm.
It was much smaller then, and I lived in it part of the time I ran the store.
Who owned it then? Do you remember?
J. Darling.
J. Darling owned that also.
Mm-hmm. Oh, I'm so stupid.
So you started in the store, and you started running it for Ding
Mr.
Darling,
Darling,
Mr.
yeah.
Darling, who owned the store, and you started running it for him around 49?
49, and I think I bought it, and took it off of his hands, if it can be described that way, in 1952. And
Was it anything like it is today? Or did it look entirely different or similar at all?
well, it looked somewhat different. There was a brown wainscoting at the bottom and white above. Now it's all white. And there were a couple of very interesting, I think the trees are still there, but there was a sign in front of the island store. It was much more rustic looking in those days. And the inside had this counter all around, and the later became a restaurant. We had tables all around the outside of the counter.
Oh.
And it was very nice, except I had to be there at night when the dining room was open. So I did most of my business at that time, hour ago. People would buy their groceries while they had their dinner.
Oh, so you still had the island, the grocery store, the
Oh,
general
yeah.
store, and a restaurant both.
Yeah, and the kitchen was where the left hand, where all the paper goods and so forth.
Uh-huh.
And there was a pass-through.
And it was Signe Whiteman, who was Carly Whiteman's mother, who was the head of the restaurant. She ran the restaurant for
the kitchen.
Parker.
Oh,
What
wow.
a good cook she was,
Oh,
too.
wasn't she?
And
What-
every Saturday night that she served
And
smorgasbord?
smorgasbord. Mhm.
Delicious.
Now, would you say that mostly just Captiva people ate there, or just local people,
Yeah.
they came
Well,
out
and
to eat at night?
people who were visiting, renters and so
Mhm.
forth during the
And
season.
friends of friends down here.
Mhm.
And I must interrupt here and tell you one wonderful story about some dinner that Signe served. It was, I suppose you'd say, family style.
Yeah.
And every night we would have a certain dish. And there were some
Oh,
people
yes.
on the island had been opting for rabbit because Signe, they knew that Signe on her farm over at Fort Myers raised rabbit. So Signe said yes, she would have house and pepper, and she announced it. And at that time, there was no telephone at the store, and people would come in and want to know what we were going to serve that night. And this couple came in. I can't remember their names now, but they used to winter down here, and they came in and they said, Signe, what's for dinner tonight? And Signe said, oh, rabbit, house and pepper. And they said, oh, well, I guess we'll wait until tomorrow. We don't care for rabbit. And their shoulders hunched and their eyebrows went up, and they said, thank you very much. We'll be back tomorrow or the next day. So Signe served the house and pepper, and everyone was delighted who was there. And the next day, these people came back and said, Signe, what's for dinner tonight? Creamed chicken. Chicken a la king, said Signe. And they said, oh, fine, we'll be in then. Well, it seems that some of the rabbit was left over, and it was the chicken a la king that they had. And after their dinner, they made a special effort, went back into the kitchen and said, Signe, that was the most delicious chicken a la king that we have ever had. We hope you'll have it many times again.
Fantastic.
Having been in merchandising, Parker thought I should help him in the store, but my idea was for a real vacation. And when I would come down, sometimes it would be necessary for him to go over to town to the bank or something, and I would reluctantly take over the store. I had really a terrible time because I'm not mechanically inclined, and adding machines and cash registers are really something that I will never understand. However, I stood behind the counter, and one day when Parker left, he said, Tim, he said, now today I'm expecting one of our very good customers, and they will probably order quite a number of things, buy quite a number of things, and you be sure to put it all down in the book. So I said, all right, I will. And in the middle of the afternoon, they arrived. They bought and bought and bought, and every time they bought, I very carefully pushed the button on the adding machine, and the tape got longer and longer. And finally, the woman said, "I guess that's all." No, wait a minute. Wait a minute. I want two more things. And she got a few more things, and I pushed a few more buttons. And finally she said, "All right, that's it." So then I pushed a button which was to total the amount. And bells rang and lights flashed, and the tape ran and ran and ran and ran. And finally, when everything stopped, I looked at the amount. And it was $1,353,142.39. Well, I knew that these were wealthy people, and they were awfully good customers of Parker's, but I was afraid that I would be accused of profiteering. So I said, "Oh, I think there's been a mistake," and I gave her the amount. She didn't flick an eye, but she said, "Oh, don't worry." She said, "My husband is a very good mathematician. Just give him the tape, he'll add it up." So I tore off the tape, which was at least 1.5 yards long, and in a matter of minutes, he had added all the columns, and he handed it back to me, and he said, "Now, here it is," and he said, "Have your husband do this again on the adding machine, and if there's any mistake, why," he said, "I will accept that." So help me, when Parker got back, he did add it up, and there was only 1 penny out. So,
Do you remember who that was?
yes, I
Oh,
remember
yeah.
who it is, but
You
I
don't
don't.
know.
I don't think I'd better.
Oh, okay.
Yes,
All right.
okay.
They're both passed on.
Yeah. Well, that was one of my experiences at the store. Another one was the day that Parker went into town, and before he left, he said, "Pin," he said, "today is the day that Mr. Futch will come over from Wolford Point to pick up his snuff." And I said,
From Buck
"Oh,
Queen.
I mean from Buckhead, yeah, well, Wolford, yeah." So he said, Mr. Futch will come over to pick up his snuff." He said, "It's in that bag back there in the storeroom, and it's $1.39. He said, that's a wholesale price to him. It's an arrangement that I make for Mr. Futch." Now, I'm sure that you will have heard who Mr. Futch is, and he lived on Buckhead. He was a very interesting gentleman. He, unfortunately, had a vitamin deficiency, which caused him to look as though he had leprosy or some dreadful disease, and it also, his skin always looked very dirty. So I thought, oh dear, I don't know how to cope with Mr. Futch if there are customers in here, but I guess I'd better do my best. Well, it so happened that there were customers when Mr. Futch arrived, and he came up to the counter very deliberately, put his moth-eaten hands on the counter, and he said, "Mrs. Mills," he said, "I've come for my snuff." I said, "Oh yes, Mr. Futch, I'll get it for you immediately." I stopped waiting on the customer. I wanted to get this man out of there because the customer's eyebrows shot high. And I got the snuff, put it on the counter, put it in a bag. I said, $1.39, Mr. Futch. "Yes, ma'am." Very deliberately, he put his hand into his pocket and pulled out a sock. Now, I've heard about people who kept their money in socks.
Oh,
But
dear.
this is the first and last time I had ever seen this. This sock was long and had seen much use. He put his hand way down into the sock and he brought out a handful of change, and very deliberately, in dimes, nickels, and pennies, he counted out the $1.39. I took a piece of cardboard and scooped it up like a coupe onto a piece of paper and put it aside so that none of Mr. Futch's germs would get into the money box that day. And away he went with his snuff. One other day at the store, and Parker was there this time and very busy, and he had ordered me some lamb's kidneys. And I came into the store and I said, "Parker, where are those lamb's kidneys?" There were a number of people standing around, and one woman came up to me rather frantically and said, "Lamb's kidneys?" "What are those?" And I looked at her and I said, "Well, they're kidneys out of lamb. What do you do with them?" "Eat them," I said. "Oh," she said, "for heaven's sake, I've just come from the shelf there and I've seen sailor's ears and kitten's paws and turkey wings, bleeding teeth, lion's paws." She said, "I thought lamb's kidneys were a shell that I'd missed."
Signe Whiteman ran the restaurant in the store for, I would guess, 6 or 7 years. And Signe Whiteman is Carly Whiteman's mother. Now lives on a farm east of Fort Myers. She was a marvelous cook, and we had a smorgasbord every Saturday night. And it was something to write home about. Then the succeeding year, Jack Van Bell and his partner, Ted Levering, who ran Mid-Island Cottages, ran the restaurant and did very nicely too. And Saturday night was always the big night. And they'd be 3 deep behind the counter during their meals, so I had to be on the job too, which was not as much of a hardship now as it would then as it would be now.
Okay.
About the fall of 1970, I decided to sell this. Somebody asked me if I would like to sell the store, and I hadn't thought about it, but I guess I would. And it turned out it took 6 or 8 months for the deal to go through, but I sold it to the Hahns, Dick and
D.
Hahn. And they took it over on the 29th of June, 1971. And
You've never been sorry, have you, dear?
no, no, the way prices shot up and the way costs ran up, even back in 71, embarrassed me. And I don't know how anybody can run a merchant, compete with the supermarkets nowadays.
About 1955, I gave up my job at Macy's. I just couldn't bear the thought of that island down there and my not being on it. So I came down to Captiva to live. I never regretted it. At that time, there were so few people on the island that everyone was a friend of everyone else. We became members of the Captiva Civic Association, and at my first meeting, I was rather taken aback to hear my name. I had been not only nominated but elected as treasurer. This was not to my liking, but however, I thought, well, Penn, be civil-minded and do the job. I'd never been a treasurer. I never could add 2 and 2 and make 4, but I got the books and finally got them in order. Found out that there were a number of people that hadn't paid dues for a number of years, but I didn't drop them off the roster. I decided to go round them up and get their money. I had a bicycle, and I rode this island from one end to the other, north to south, and across what little there is, east and west, and got to know every person on this island. I would go and I would knock on a door or ring a bell, and if I didn't know the people, I would say, "I'm Penn Mills, treasurer of the Civic Association. You haven't paid your dues for 3 years. Now, don't you want to help the Civic Association? And it's only a matter of $1 a year. That'd be $3. We really would like to have your money." They would smile and say, "Well, of course, we forgot all about it." And they would give me a check or their 3 $1 bills. This I did for 3 years, I believe it was.
Do you remember who was president when you were treasurer?
Yes, Jack McMurray was one of the presidents. I believe Johnny Wakefield was president too. Jack was the president the latter part of my treasuryship, because I remember one cold time in January. Jack came in. I was having a very bad time with my back at the time. And I had exercises which I had to do lying on the floor. I had the fireplace going and I was exercising, raising my legs and kicking and doing the things that I had to do to strengthen my back. And the bell rang and I said, "Come on in." And there was Jack, our former consul to China. And I had one leg in the air and I said, "Excuse me, Jack," but I said, "I'm taking my exercises. What is it you're talking about?" He said, "Oh, well, we're going to have a civic association meeting and I want you to be there." So with me on the floor and Jack on the sofa, I discussed business. And that's the way, in those days, our business was carried out. And we didn't do too badly either. One member that we had in the Civic Association was a dog, and he paid dues. His name was Shylock. He had formerly belonged to Parker, but somehow or other had wandered down the beach and attached himself to the Reddies. And when I went to collect the membership dues from Philip, he said, "How about making Shylock a member of the Civic Association? He's a good citizen of Captiva." I said, "Of course, absolutely." So I got another extra $1 for the Civic Association.
I think that they didn't like the name Shylock, so they gave the dog Shamrock.
Shamrock.
They called him
Yes, they
Shamrock.
called him Shylock.
I named him Shylock because I'd seen the Merchant of Venice at about the time I got the dog.
After my tenure as treasurer of the Civic Association, I then took over the selling of the books at the ABC sale. As far as I can remember, I think I did it from the very beginning up until the time that B. Kepnick took it over last year, in 1978.
And you worked with her on that one, too.
Oh yes, I worked with her. And when Hazel Roberts was here, Hazel was a great craftswoman and a beautiful weaver. I saw some of her things when she first came down. And at that time, I was making mobiles out of driftwood. And I looked at her things, and I looked at my mobiles, and I said, "Hazel, you know, these things go together very well, very well." She called her weaving indigenous weaving because she used bits of grasses, shells, beach glass, any number of things that she collected around the island. I said, "Why don't we have an exhibition and sale of our things and give part of the proceeds to the Civic Association?" Hazel thought this was a good idea, and thereby hangs a tale. We did it, and we did it, and we did it. And each year we gave a portion of those, a portion of the money that we made to different organizations. When we were raising money for the new library, we did it for the library. One year we gave it to the Sanibel Captiva Conservation Foundation. Another year we gave it to Coretta. And until the tourists came and grabbed up all the driftwood, we would have our sale every year. The library has always been a pet of mine, and when we first started the library in the community center building itself, I was there and helped organize and catalog the books. I knew nothing about library. I had no library experience. Knew nothing about libraries except the fact that I'd always taken books out to read. And one day this attractive woman came in to the library, and her ankle was in a cast. My wrist was in a cast also because I had broken it recently. And I heard her say, you know, I'm interested in this because I'm a librarian. Well, I found out who she was, and it was my friend, Hazel Roberts. So I went to Paul Everett, who was then president of the Civic Association. I said, Paul, we've got a librarian. And he said, I know we have, you're it. I said, no longer. Let's get Hazel Roberts. He said, who's Hazel Roberts? So I explained that the Roberts were newcomers here on the island. And they, of course, built and owned your house, Jean, you know.
Uh-huh.
What a nice house it is, too. So Hazel took over, and she was our first, well, no, not our first professional librarian, because Peg Dunham, who was also a librarian, had done some work there with me, too. But Hazel took over and was the permanent librarian. Peg did a good job, but she was not here during the summertime, and we did have borrowers come during the summer. Hazel said she'd take this job only if I would stay on and help, which I was very glad to do because of my interest in the library and because of my friendship with Hazel. So I became the associate librarian and helped design the present building that houses our library, and stayed on as Hazel's associate until she left when she moved away from the island. Parker mentioned our cistern where I used to spread out my driftwood when I was making mobiles. That cistern has been a great joy to me because it holds 7,000 gallons of wonderful rainwater. However, it does have to be cleaned occasionally. And in those days, when we had no official plumber on the island, Uncle Joe Whiteman used to clean the cisterns. And I contacted Joe, and I arranged to have the cistern cleaned one summer when we were away. When I came back, I got the bill from Joe and sent him a check. The next time I saw him, he said, Pin, he said, I made a notation about cleaning that cistern, and it's out on the sea grate, the trunk of the sea grate in front of the house over on the left-hand side. So I wandered back among my sea grates, and sure enough, I found, gouged into the bark of the sea grate, cistern cleaned, May 5th, 1954. Cistern, S-I-S-T-R-N, C-L-E-E-N-E-D. I mentioned at one time Mr. Futch. He was a real gentleman, and everybody realized this. And particularly Jay Darling, who was very much interested in him and his background, which no one was ever able to fathom. He spoke very good English. And he used to come, row over from Buck Key to Tweenwaters to pick up the garbage because he would take it back and feed his pigs, which he raised. He came over one day. I forgot to say that always on top of the garbage were some very neatly packed paper bags into which Mrs. Price had instructed the kitchen help to put some of the rolls or leftover food that she could no longer serve. It was perfectly good food, but there were things that would not go onto the Tweenwaters table. So Mr. Futch came over, picked up the garbage, and very carefully would take the paper bags off the top. And he was heard to remark one day to Mr. Darling, You know, Mrs. Price has such lovely swill. Mr. Futch's wife, a dear little old lady named Honey, whom he called Honey, would come over with him. He would row her over in the boat, and she would help him with the swill, and then they would go back. One day, he rowed over, and Honey was with him. But when he tied the boat up to the dock, Honey didn't get out. It seemed that the night before, Honey had died. He had put her, sat her into the boat, rowed her over, and someone on the island took charge. They made a box, and they put Honey in the box. And then Honey made her last trip into Fort Myers. The box was hoisted onto someone's truck. The truck had no tailgate. So there was the box. The truck started over across Sanibel. In those days, Sanibel, the road was not paved. It was a corduroy road. And you had to drive very fast or be shaken to death. Somehow or other, Ted Levering was in on this last ride of Honey's, and he followed the truck. Ted says that every 2 or 3 miles, the box that Honey was in would bounce and bounce and bounce and almost bounce off the truck. Ted would blow his horn violently, the truck would stop, they'd hoist Honey back on to the truck, and away they went into Fort Myers via the good old ferry, which we all miss now. In 1960, I had itchy feet, and Maud Meyer and I took a 6-month trip to the South Pacific and the Orient. We were having a beautiful time, and one morning when we were in Nara, Japan, I picked up the English newspaper there and was horrified to see on the front page a picture, Dateline, Fort Myers, Florida, USA. There were palm trees blowing in the wind, water blowing across the pavement, and it said that a hurricane had hit this area in Florida. And I thought to myself, if it's hit Fort Myers, it's hit Captiva. I wonder what's going to be left when I get back. And when Maud came down to breakfast, I said, Maud, have you looked at your paper this morning? She said, no, why? What's happened? And I told her. Well, we were due to leave Nara, but we were coming back, and we tried to send, we talked about sending cables, but we didn't think any cables would come through. However, when we got back to Tokyo, I had a letter from Parker, who had said,
well, I don't remember what I said in the letter, but I set out for the hurricane here. I was in St. Petersburg visiting a friend on my way to my sister. This was September 10th, 1960. I date things from that day, before and after the hurricane. I came back when Donna was announced, so I would be here because everything I had, including my store, was here. And I was drinking in those days, and so I went through the night without any pain. Woke up the next morning and had a look at the yard. I had had it cleaned immaculately. Pin was due back from the Orient in another 3 weeks. There wasn't a twig out of place. After the hurricane, it was a shambles, and I felt awfully sorry for myself till I saw the rest of the island, and then I realized I'd come out pretty well. No pine trees had been broken off any.
You just stayed here in the house
I stayed
through the hurricane.
Through the hurricane.
And you didn't have any bad damage?
No, I had my car parked in Mary Bailey's carport, aiming towards the Gulf, and of course it got so flooded I couldn't start it the next morning.
That's the house next door to you now,
Yeah.
south of you.
Yeah, and then I walked down to the store, and of course the power went off in the evening, and was off for a week or 10 days, I guess. And I had to give away a lot of my frozen food and throw it out, and ice cream and so forth, and it was sort of heartbroken. And I later on looked into the cost of hurricane insurance to protect me from that sort of thing, and it would have cost me more then I never lost, so I never carried it again, because we have not had a hurricane since then.
Knock on wood.
In the old days, Andy's Dock was the place of entertainment, and Dessa and Andy held forth, and Alice O'Brien, who was a wonderful woman, had a party out on Andy's Dock one Saturday night, and Pin and I went, and I walked in, and who should I see at the far end of the room but Adlai Stevens. And Pin said I just left him flat, and my mouth wide open, and drool. I'd always been an admirer of Adlai Stevens since I first heard him on TV from bar to theater, and I never understood quite why that party. In those days, it was everybody. He was visiting Alice O'Brien or the Rosses, I guess, and everybody from the Gold Coast was at this party, and it was a wonderful feeling. And
Andy's Dock, where the elite.
oh, Andy's
right?
Dock. Oh, yes. And then Andy's Dock. That was a very nice place. We got into that in the first. We rented our first inboard motor.